So chapter 14, verses 1 to 6.
It happened that when he went into the house of one of the leaders of the Pharisees on the Sabbath to eat bread, they were watching him closely. And there in front of him was a man suffering from dropsy. And Jesus answered and spoke to the lawyers and Pharisees, saying, Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? But they kept silent. And he took hold of him and healed him and sent him away. And he said to them, Which one of you will have a son or an ox fall into a well and will not immediately pull him out on a Sabbath day? And they could make no reply to this.
He's willing to go to the house of even self-righteous Pharisees because they need him too. And he's on the spot. I mean, they're watching him. They're scrutinizing every move. It must have been nerve-wracking. They're trying to come up with some incriminating slip. It reminds me so much of what politicians do. Just ransacking every detail. I mean, you think about how often politicians will come up with some obscure detail back, years and years, maybe decades before. They're just pouring over everything Jesus does. And I think this situation might have been a setup. You got this guy suffering from dropsy here that I think they might have kind of planted there to see what Jesus was going to do. Now, what in the world is dropsy? The swelling, that's dropsy. You don't know what that's caused by. Congestive heart failure, kidney failure, might be several options. So this is just kind of referring to the symptom. But he's, filled up with water, retained fluids. Jesus says, well, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? And what's their answer?
They kept silent.
Why?
They couldn't win.
Yeah, if they say it is, then they can't accuse Jesus. If they say it's not, well, who wants to argue that it's not right to heal on the Sabbath? Yeah, they want to complain, they want to criticize, but they don't want to come up with a positive statement. Mm-hmm. So, Jesus healed him, and then he said, which one of you will have a son or an ox fall into a well and will not immediately pull him out on a Sabbath day? If it was your child, for that matter, if it was your dumb animal that fell into a well, what would be the danger of falling into a well?
You could drown.
You could drown. What's wrong with this guy? He's drowning. So you wouldn't even make your own animal wait, showing that they're partial. It's their animal. Oh no, we've got to get him out on Sabbath day. If it's this poor fellow, oh well, he can come tomorrow. So I think that's a pretty powerful response on Jesus' part. They could make no reply to this either. They're finding themselves being silent often here, aren't they? What do you say to that? What could they say? So remember the context. We're here at dinner in one of the leaders of the Pharisees' houses. This is probably, pretty high-class affair since he's a leading Pharisee. You can imagine there's status involved with this. So Jesus, he may be being watched, but he does plenty of watching of his own. And he notices some things that lead him to giving some, counsel to the guests. And then he turns around and gives some counsel to the host. So 7 to 11.
And he began speaking the parable to the invited guests when he noticed how they had been picking out the places of honor at the table, saying to them, when you are invited by someone to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, lest someone more distinguished than you may have been invited by him. And he who invited you both shall come to you and say, give place to this man. And in a disgrace you proceed to occupy the last place. But when you are invited, go and recline at the last place. So when the one who has invited you comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. Then you'll have honor in the sight of all who are at the table with you. For everyone who exalts himself should be humbled, and he who humbles himself should be exalted.
So Jesus is watching this game of musical chairs they seem to be playing, where everybody's trying to jockey for position to get the, most elevated seats. They hadn't listened to Proverbs very well. Proverbs 25:6, do not claim honor in the presence of the king, and do not stand in the place of great men. For it is better that it be said to you, come up here, than for you to be placed lower in the presence of the prince whom your eyes have seen. So again, Jesus picking up on some Old Testament teachings, but it's like, these guys, all they care about is glory and honor, they want attention, And Jesus is seeing them, and he realizes, he knows the game they're playing, he knows exactly what they want. And so Jesus says, this is not a good idea. You know, somebody invites you to a wedding feast, and you take one of the, highest seats, and then somebody really important comes, and the master of ceremonies has to come to you and say, listen, I'm sorry, but there's somebody, really important that needs this seat. And then what are you going to have to do?
Sit at the table by the kitchen.
Why?
That's all that's left.
Exactly. Everybody else has been doing the same thing. They've occupied all the seats, the greatest willable. So he has to sit down at the bottom, because he was, too glory hungry. Somebody noticed he was sitting too low and said, oh, please move up higher. That would be, better. So we shouldn't promote ourselves. We should let other people recognize us. Somebody has said, he who tooteth not his own horn, the same shall not be tooted. So that's kind of the philosophy some people have. I'm going to have to promote myself. Nobody else is going to do it. But so think about how this is practical. I mean, what happens when they're looking for somebody, they're looking for some people to do some big important job. I'll do it, pick me, I want to do it. How do you look at people who more or less do that? How do we see them? I'd say immature. Mm-hmm. Think about when like elders are chosen in the congregation. I didn't know this personally, but I knew from some guy who knew the church very well that a particularly pretty good sized church was picking elders, and it became pretty clear they were headed that direction for like 6 months. This guy was just like, he attended every service, and he was, went out with everybody, had everybody into his home, went and visited the hospital, everybody in the nursing home and all this. And he hadn't been doing that before. Politicking, more or less, to get chosen. He was, actually, I think, which is not a good thing. But it's like, wow, that just, hey, if this is something you think is an honor, don't you ever suggest yourself for it. If somebody else says, listen, you really need to do this. We really need you for this. And we want you to, and we feel like you're qualified, okay. But this idea of always having our hand in the air and just trying to promote ourselves, it's embarrassing. And it's not humble. We've got to quit wanting to be seen and be recognized. And of course, Jesus is not talking mostly about table manners. He's talking mostly about our position in spiritual realms and just our attitude toward ourselves, the humility we ought to have. But you can imagine, that probably made people a little tense when Jesus talked about that. Thoughts and comments?
I think it's fine to volunteer even eagerly for something, but you can just kind of tell the people who are volunteering because they're excited about the work or something that needs to be done versus they're volunteering because they're excited about being seen.
So it's mostly what you're volunteering for. If it's cleaning the bathrooms, yeah, feel free. Volunteer all you want. If it's something that everybody sees as a great honor and you're doing it so that you can get attention, no. It needs to be, like you say, because you care about what's done. And even at that, in some things, it's just not really up to us to suggest ourselves. We were just the other day, I think this was a good way of doing this. Some of us talked about it ahead of time. Our treasurer just moved, and so he'd been the treasurer the whole time I'd been there. And so we needed to find somebody else. Well, how do you do that? And somebody suggested, well, we'll take volunteers. And fortunately, the guy who was chairing the meeting had thought this out and said, that's probably not the best idea in this situation. Because the people who are going to say, yeah, I'll do it, may not be the people who are the most respected, and you kind of need somebody pretty respected to deal with the money. And so what we finally did, which I think was a good idea, we talked about what kind of a person do we need? Kind of what are some of the characteristics? What it involves, and kind of the idea, to be somebody who, everybody's kind of going to respect and trust and things like that. And then we gave everybody, a sheet of paper and said, write down 3 people that you think would be well qualified. And then we sent the 3 of the teenagers out to tabulate the votes, and they came back and told us we asked him to tell us the top two, but there was a tie, so he told us the top three. And one of them is moving also, so he couldn't do it. And the other two, we kind of talked back and forth, and, one of them said, okay, it wasn't the one, neither one of them was really like, hey, I really want to do this. But they were both willing, and they were both men older than me that we all respect very much, and really good choices, which is better than, this idea of, okay, I'll do it. Some things it's fine. If it's cleaning the bathrooms and doing things that are, tasks that just somebody needs to do, it's good to volunteer. Although even at that, have you ever noticed the guy who's just volunteers for everything? It's almost like we have this compulsion. We think we've got to do everything. Well, some things just need to be spread around. I mean, even if you'll do it, don't do everything. I mean, don't always be the person. It's great to host things or to do things, but I mean, don't make it a monopoly, because it's good for other people to do things too. So it's just kind of a balance that we have to think about. Well, think about the disciples. How many times did they argue about who's the greatest? I mean, for crying out loud. We want people to think we're the greatest, but we usually don't argue about it. I mean, maybe we do more than we think we do, but it just shows you, I mean, human nature is a lot like that. Well, he's got some things to say to the hosts. 12 to 14.
And he also went on to say to the one who had invited him, when you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors. Otherwise, they may also invite you in return, and that will be your repayment. But when you give a reception, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed, since they do not have the means to repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous.
So he criticizes where the guest sat and who the host invited. Who should you not invite?
Your friends.
Your friends. The people who can pay you back. Why not?
Because they might do it.
They might pay you back, and that'll be all you get. Invite the people who really need it that you get no, return from. Now, he's not saying don't ever have anybody you like in your home. But he's saying the real hospitality is not having your best friends over all the time. That's not hospitality. That may be fun. But if you're really trying to serve and help people, serve and help the people who won't be able to invite you back. The people who need the help. We can sometimes pat ourselves on the back because we're so hospitable to our three best friends we always love hanging out with. Well, no, that didn't really, that may be cool and may be fun, but it's probably not hospitality. Are we making a sacrifice? Are we really sharing with people who need it? And I think that's a very perceptive observation on Jesus' part. This is the generosity that's self-serving, that's not really generosity. And again, Jesus is frank in what he says. Thoughts and comments? Use our hospitality in self-serving ways. We ought to be self-sacrificing. And there may be some times we need to, correct. I mean, we're not Jesus, but attitudes need to be dealt with. I think so. I mean, I think you see very self-centered attitudes in us. I mean, I think that's the thing. I mean, how much are we like this? How much are we self-centered? How much stuff do we do that's really focused on ourselves? We're trying to get attention. We want people to notice, or we want to be invited back, or we want to have fun. And we glory ourselves in the fact, oh, look at all we did. But we weren't doing it for the Lord or for other people. We were doing it for ourselves. I mean, that's the scary thing. You can do good stuff, but it's really for you and not for God.
What do you do about the good stuff that needs to be done that you also like? Like, there's some things that, need to be done, but you have to be seen doing it, or, does that make sense?
Yeah, so that's a challenge. Because it's hard to do something that will be seen and respected and not be very self-aware in that.
And then when you're self-aware about it, you're like, oh, it kind of builds on itself.
So I think our goal is to focus on the Lord, to seek His will, and just to forget ourselves. it's, being humble is almost a byproduct. The more you seek to be humble and the more you're trying to show off your humility, the less you are. Humility is almost just not thinking about yourself. I've probably used this illustration before. But one of the more humble men, I think, truly, that I was able to be somewhat close to, he was 60 then. And, he was a good man and active and, was preacher and, a lot of meetings and things like that. I spent the summer with him kind of interning or shadowing him or whatever. And, my idea was I learned by asking questions, so I asked him tons of questions. But questions I asked him about himself, he struggled to answer. Not because he didn't want to answer, because he didn't think about himself. And I really noticed all that summer. He didn't think about himself. And he focused a lot on other people, a lot on the Lord. He was very dedicated. He was very capable, did a very good job, very down to earth. I'd heard him preach a lot growing up, and I always enjoyed listening to his lessons. I always learned a lot and found them very practical. But he was just very focused on what needed to be done. And I just don't think he ever really thought much about himself. It just really wasn't his focus. And it wasn't like he was running himself down all the time. I mean, that can be very self-serving. He didn't do that. He was just he did what needed to be done. I think we got to work toward that. Work toward just not thinking about ourselves. And you see what happens to people who are self-conscious. We're either feeling all embarrassed and worthless and, inferior and inadequate and we can't do anything right, or we're feeling all prideful and, full of ourselves because we did it so well. So we go from pride to low self-esteem and back and forth because we're focused on us. And I think we just got to try to take that away. But that's a challenge. So it's not that it's wrong to do something that'll be seen. It's wrong to do it to be seen. I mean, and you see, who did Jesus reach out to? Who was he received by? Who was he willing to be close to? And it wasn't necessarily the people that would be attractive people. And it wasn't the beautiful people. So yeah, good point.
You really see that sort of false humility in Saul early on. He didn't want to be king, and he was hiding in the baggage, and he didn't want to go out to his first battle. And you see that and you think, oh, he's such a humble, good man. But then when he gets on top, he becomes very proudful and doesn't want to share limelight with David. Compare that with David, with his encounter with Goliath. David almost kind of looks cocky, but I think really he's just confident because he's thinking about God and not about his abilities.
Excellent comment. Amen. Well, I wondered how to read verse 15. But I'm seeing this as somebody in the audience, somebody in the house that's really getting stressed about Jesus's rather outspoken comment. When one of those who were reclining at the table with him heard this, he said to him, "Blessed is everyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God." Let's change the subject and talk about something happy. Won't it be great when we all get to heaven? I could just see somebody doing that. People hate, may make somebody feel bad. We want everybody to feel good. And so that's what I'm guessing. You can see it how you want to. That gave Jesus an opportunity to teach a parable that was every bit as awkward as everything he'd said so far. Jesus said, well, yes, but not everybody who thinks they're going will. And he breaks the etiquette again with what he teaches. So 16 to 24.
Then he said to him, a certain man gave a great supper and invited many, and sent his servant at supper time to say to those who were invited, "Come, for all things are now ready." But they all with one accord began to make excuses. The first said to him, "I have bought a piece of ground, and I must go and see it. I ask you to have me excused." And another said, "I have bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I am going to test them. I ask you to have me excused." Another said, "I have married a wife, and therefore I cannot come." So that servant came and reported these things to his master. Then the master of the house, being angry, said to his servant, "Go out quickly into the streets and lanes of the city, and bring in here the poor, the maimed, and the lame, and the blind." And the servant said, Master, it is done as you commanded, and there is still room. Then the master said to the servant, Go out into the highways and hedges, and compel them to come, so that my house may be filled. For I say to you that none of those men who were invited shall taste my supper.
Well, so given a big banquet, he sends prior written invitations and a bunch of people RSVP'd that they'd love to come. And then when the time came, what happened?
Excuses.
They all had reasons not to.
They couldn't come. You ever done that? Ever fixed a lot of food and invited some people in the last minute that you have to beg off? It's kind of a bummer. It's really a bummer if it's like, they don't have a really good reason. It's a bummer even if they do, right? You know, they all got sick or something. You know, it's like I cooked all this food, and we at least have refrigerators and freezers for the food. You know, they didn't have that. You cooked food. What are you going to do with it if nobody shows up to eat it? So, I mean, how would we view guests that beg off for maybe not the greatest reasons?
Impolite.
Yeah, very impolite, insensitive, you know, uncaring, and they're all no-shows, and the host is upset. He's angry. And I don't know. What do you think about these items? I mean, I bought a piece of land, I need to go out and look at it. I mean, the ridiculous thing would be, why did you buy the land without looking at it? You know, but I mean, buying a piece of land is kind of a big investment. You know, and well, I bought the 5 yoke of oxen and I need to try them out. Well, isn't that what we do? You know, we buy something and we need to see how to work. And I've married a wife and I cannot come. That may sound like a big excuse, but people were exempt from military service for a year after marrying. So, I mean, the Old Testament sort of recognizes some validity in that. I think perhaps these are not just totally lame. But this is a dinner that's so important that I don't care what the excuse is. It's a bad one. You got to go to this dinner. You said you wouldn't, you need to. No excuses are considered valid. I don't care what it was. You know, there's priorities. And there's some things that are important enough that you just rearrange your schedule. I mean, you may have bought some land, bought some oxen, married a wife or whatever, but think about this. Where are they? They're at this chief Pharisee's house. These people wouldn't have treated this dinner this way. They were there. You know, you don't miss a dinner like this. You don't get an invitation like this every day of the week. I think that's the lesson in some of this is, you know, this is a top priority. Well, when the master was angry, he said, go out and get anybody. Bring them in. The streets, lanes, you know, poor, crippled, blind, lame. You know, and here's the thing about these guys. They didn't get invitations like this. They'll come. This is the best thing's ever happened to them. You know, they're not all that tied to this life. They don't have anything. And they're not offended to be second string replacements. And then there's still room, and he says, don't take no for an answer. Go anywhere. Make them come. Overcome your shyness and scour the countryside and get them in here. I want people to take advantage of this supper. So, you know, the other thing that we really see in this then, who are the best prospects for the gospel? The desperate, not the respectable. And we need to take the gospel to everybody insistently. Preach the word in season and out of season. God wants people. Look, think about it this way. You know, if you prepared a big meal, big feast, man, it's really frustrating for nobody to show up, especially after they RSVP. Look at what God did in preparing the heavenly banquet. Look at Jesus' sacrifice and all the suffering and sacrifice God went through. He wants people to know about it and to come. And He wants us to be going out and getting people to come in and not taking no for an answer. We are entirely too shy about talking about the Lord and inviting people to Him. I think this really makes you think about this. It makes me think about it. I mean, you take the early Christians. They told people about the Lord. They encouraged them. They admonished them. They persuaded them to come to Christ. We need to do more of that. You know, those who persistently decline to come to God's feast will be forever excluded from enjoying it. I mean, this is more the door being shut. I mean, you know, here's the problem. You're not missing out on one feast. You're missing out on feasting for the rest of eternity. Jesus got a lot of mileage out of dinner invitation, don't you think? Wow. He has the healing and what he said about that, and then the counsel to the guests and to the host, and the discussion about the Lord's great dinner, and that's a lot. One lunchtime visit with the chief Pharisee. Anything else?
He repeats those to invite from verse 13, and then the ones that he said go out in 21, the exact same people.
Excellent point. I had that in my notes, but I didn't. Yeah, so he invites the very one he encourages the host to invite. Yeah. And you think about it. Think about 1 Corinthians 1, and not many, not mighty, not many noble, and all that were called. Really, we may struggle in finding, successful people in this life that really are eager for the gospel. But there's people in this world who are down and out, and they're going to be a lot more receptive. That's just the norm. They may not be the people who we want. As we were saying earlier, they may not live right next door if we live in the places where we live, but they're in the world, and we need to go out to the highways and the byways, go wherever they are. That may not be next door, but go to the places where people really are willing to listen. Jesus has been in the chief Pharisee's house giving various teachings and instructions, but now he's going on with his disciples, going along the way, large crowd, and he's teaching them about what it really means to be a disciple. So would somebody read, this is Luke 14, verses 25 to 35.
Now large crowds were going along with him, and he turned and said to them, If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. For which one of you, when he wants to build a tower, does not first sit down and calculate the cost to see if he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who observe it begin to ridicule him, saying, This man began to build and was not able to finish. Or what king, when he sets out to meet another king in battle, will not first sit down and consider whether he is strong enough with 10,000 men to encounter the one coming against him with 20,000? Or else, while the other is still far away, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace. So then, none of you can be my disciple who does not give up all his own possessions. Therefore, salt is good, but if even salt has become tasteless, with what will it be seasoned? It is useless either for the soil or for the manure pile. It is thrown out. He who has ears to hear, let him hear.
Okay. So, don't they say about the Marines that they're looking for a few good? Jesus wanted recruits, very upfront and clear about the requirements. He focuses on what is really going to take on their part to be a disciple. He's got several things he says. In verse 26, he's going to have to put Jesus ahead of his family and himself. Now, he uses very strong language when he says, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his family and himself. Hating here not in the sense of seeking to work malice or abhorring. In the sense of loving less. That's the way it's used in Deuteronomy 21:15. But it does mean that you are renouncing everything else in comparison with the Lord. He has to be front and center. He's top priority. Everything else is nothing by comparison to him, even ourselves. That's a really challenging thing. And then he says to carry his own cross and come after him. You would carry your cross to the place of crucifixion. And so it's like saying you have to die to yourself. You have to be willing to give over to the Lord. I've been crucified with Christ in Galatians 2:20. And Christ lives in me. I don't live in me any longer. If I'm a disciple of Christ, he should take over my life. In 33, he says, none can be my disciple who does not give up all his own possessions. our attachment to things we have can be a real barrier to being a disciple. So we have to relinquish all of our possessions. Give Christ then control over our relationships, ourselves, and everything we own. Jesus comes first. And it really makes you think when you look at this, am I really a disciple? Wow. I mean, this is challenging to consider everything as the Lord's, to give ownership and control of everything in our life over to God. Is this the way to attract the largest number of followers, do you think? Wouldn't it be better if kind of watered down the requirements, made it sound like it would be easy, and then when you get people kind of reeled in, then you start ramping up what he asks? Jesus was not like that. Jesus never hides the requirements in the fine print. In fact, he says, you really shouldn't even try this until you really assess. Don't enter into this lightly. I mean, think about a guy who starts building a big tower and then halfway through realizes he can't finish. He doesn't have enough money. You see that every once in a while, right? Some kind of unfinished building, and you wonder what happened. That was kind of pointless. Why invest all that in it and not get finished? But sometimes we don't calculate what's going to be required. Or worse yet, here's this king who challenges another king to battle. He declares war. And notice, while the other is still far away, didn't take him long, they're still a long ways away, and he realized, oh no, I'm hopelessly outnumbered. I miscalculated the enemy's strength, and you have to call for a peace treaty before you can engage in the battle. That's very foolish. So he's saying, don't do that with being my disciple. You really need to analyze what it's going to take and whether or not you're willing to give it. Jesus never deceived his followers. He never made them think that this is easier than what it is. He challenges people who wanted to follow to think about, this is what it takes. Do you really want to do it? That's a sobering thing, even for us. Thoughts and comments about this through verse 33. 34 and 35. And he says, salt is good, but if even salt has become tasteless, with what will it be seasoned? I think in this context, he's talking about disciples without dedication. Disciples that don't have this commitment and this prioritizing of the Lord's call in their life. Can you imagine salt with no taste? What would you use it for? I can't think of a lot of things salt does if salt loses its saltiness. Why would you want it? A disciple that doesn't have the distinctive qualities of discipleship that Jesus has been talking about, what good is he? He's just a useless pile of waste. Throw him away. So he's saying that these requirements that he's talking about in discipleship are the distinctive nature of a disciple. You take a disciple without commitment, they're worthless. They're nothing. Just throw it away. And then he says, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. God put ears on sinners to listen to him and to heed his instructions. Thoughts and comments on any of this then in chapter 14?
I like how at the end there he does say, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. I think that kind of brings it back to, yes, the requirements are tough, but it is open for everybody.
It is.
Everybody needs to hear it.
So how much money do you have to be a disciple? How much talent and ability, how, charismatic, how athletic, how beautiful. None of those things. But you have to give whatever it is that you have to the Lord and let him take that and use it as he sees fit. So it doesn't take somebody that has a lot of assets. You don't have to have any. But whatever assets you've got to dedicate to God. So it's for anybody, everybody. There's nobody who doesn't have the ability to be a disciple. But even if you've got lots of abilities, you may not be a disciple because you're hoarding them for yourself instead of relinquishing control of them to the Lord. Other thoughts or comments?
You can be my disciple, but he does not give up all his own possessions. That seems pretty direct and straightforward, yet we don't see that in application throughout the rest of the New Testament. Not direct.
It depends, I think, on what you mean by giving up all your possessions. I don't think he's saying that you necessarily have to sell out and give everything like to the treasury of the church or something like that, necessarily. But that you have to give everything you've got to the Lord. It's His, and you use it for Him instead of using it for yourself. So you do with it what the Lord wants you to do. I think that's the idea. Because you're right. Even in Luke Acts, you think about, situations where people still had private property. It's not like they had, completely divested themselves of any ownership of anything. But the things they owned, they considered to be God's if they were disciples, and they used them for Him. I mean, Jesus often, I think, says things to try to almost shock us, just really stop and think. Jesus was not understated in a lot of this. It's almost like he says it in the boldest possible way to really get our attention. I mean, the idea of you're carrying a cross, understanding that it meant to your crucifixion. I mean, you could assume he meant everybody needs to commit suicide. Well, he did, but not physically. He meant give your life to God, kill yourself, die to self, and live to the Lord. But it wasn't exactly what the surface meaning might have indicated. But it sure does get your attention. I mean, it would be like saying, whoever does not go to the electric chair and come after me. Well, I mean, there's only one thing they do in electric chairs. It's not for massages. So.
It's just saying, like, destroy this temple and in 3 days I'll rebuild it. There were those that were looking at the building, and he's like, okay, you're thinking building, you're not even on my wavelength. It's like he says those things almost to mislead those that aren't of the right mind.
And perhaps to intrigue and call for further study on those who are interested and eager. I mean, he talks to Nicodemus about being born all over again. He talks to the woman at the well about this, we'll never ever thirst again. And so tons of examples like that. But yeah, good points.
It's like he's using it to weed people out, sort of.
Yes.
Which goes back to the, if you've got ears, hear it.
The rich get richer and the poor get poorer. The one who has, more is given. The one who doesn't have, even what he has is taken away. So the people who really care and willing to dig, they're going to get blessed by this. They're going to understand more. The people who aren't, they just further, away and bewildered and turned off by what Jesus said. So I think he is weeding out.